Okay, it's 7:02. How about we get started? Good evening and welcome everyone. Fort Lee Public Library, with co-sponsorship from the Friends of the Fort Lee Public Library, is excited to host Joshua M. Greene, author of Unstoppable, Siggi B. Wilzig's astonishing journey from Auschwitz survivor and penniless immigrant to Wall Street legend. Greene is a renowned Holocaust scholar and filmmaker whose biographies have sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. Greene is a popular lecturer who has spoken at the Pentagon and before the Judge Advocate General's College, and his documentaries on Holocaust history have aired on PBS and Discovery. He has appeared on national media outlets from NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross to Fox News, CNN, and more. Visit his website at joshuamgreene.info. Tonight is not a standard Zoom meeting. This is a webinar. Please type any questions you have for Joshua in the Q&A and not in the chat. I will be keeping track of the questions in the Q&A, which will be answered toward the end of Joshua's talk. Now I will turn it over to Joshua.
Thank you, Carrie. Hello, everybody. Good evening. I'm so sorry that we're not together. I was looking forward to meeting each one of you individually, and that won't be possible now. But such are the circumstances of the world around us currently. I'm very honored that the Fort Lee Public Library and the Friends of the Library have invited me to speak with you this evening. Here's how this can work. I'll talk to you a little bit about the story of Siggy Wilzig. I'll give you a brief summary of his saga, which is a real rags to riches, David and Goliath kind of epic tale. And at the end of which I'm going to show you a very brief film. It only runs about 4 minutes, but this will be a chance for you to meet and hear from Siggy and hear him speak in his own words and tell you a little bit about his life. And after that very brief film, which is a composite of clips from the testimony that he gave to the Shoah Foundation back at the end of 2002, I'll come back and we'll have a chance to talk together about some of the themes and issues of Holocaust remembrance that are underscored by Siggy's story. It bears mentioning that he spent the last years of his life in Fort Lee. He had a co-op apartment in the plaza overlooking the Hudson, and from the balcony of his 17th floor apartment, he could see the vista of Manhattan across the water. And so this particular evening is of special significance to me, special importance to me. It took about 7 years to write this book. I'm pleased that it's done as well as it has. And I think you'll find this story engaging, and I look forward to discussing with you at the other end. So here's how we're going to do this. I'll begin with the story of Siggy. I'm going to be holding up some photographs as a way of illustrating this first part of our program. And so I think you'll be able to see these. Let's start with the beginning. Siggy was born in 1927 in Krojanka, which was a village in West Prussia. Here's a picture of him at age 6 when he was just starting school. And it was the custom then to give children starting school a big cone full of candy. So that's what you're looking at there. As a child in West Prussia, he spent more time running away from Jew haters and other kids who were looking to beat him up than he did spending time in school. And by the time he was 7 years old, 8 years old, the anti-Semitism was mounting in West Prussia. And so Siggy and his brothers and sisters and mother and father fled under the cover of night and relocated to Berlin. Now in Berlin, here you see Siggy, let's see, there he is. You'll see he's the smallest one in the photo. This is his elementary school photo. Siggy never got any taller than 5'5.5". And he always kind of referred to himself jokingly as a bit of a shrimp. Every one of the 100 people I interviewed, however, for this book, remembered him as a giant personality. So there's this ironic contrast between his physical size and the dimensions of his story and his accomplishments. When the school system was closed to Jews, Siggy was put to work by the Nazi officials in Berlin in a munitions factory where he worked with other slave laborers, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then finally, in 1943, 16-year-old Siggy Wilzig was deported along with his family and other Jews of Berlin to concentration camp Auschwitz. Because he was a small child and always had to defend himself, he learned to grow up very quickly. He learned to think and act like an adult from a very, very young age. And my impression after having spent all this time studying his life is that that adult-like way of thinking served him very well when he got to Auschwitz. For example, on arrival, he didn't know that anyone under the age of 18 was immediately sent to the gas chambers. But when the guard asked him, as he was pushed out of the cattle cars, "How old are you?" He said 18. Actually, he was not quite 17. But where that came from, he said, "I have no idea." He was a very religious man and believed that the Almighty always had a hand on his shoulder and would give him these clues about how to stay alive. Another example, once he was inside the camp, it was freezing cold. He arrived in January. He quickly caught pneumonia and was losing weight very quickly. He had to find work. If he didn't find work, he would be killed. He heard guards talking and discussing how they needed bricklayers. So he walked over, whipped off his cap and said, "Jawohl," he spoke German. He said, "Jawohl, Herr Kommandant," flattering the guards. "I've had many years' experience as a master bricklayer." Well, later to a reporter, he once described that he knew about as much about bricklaying as the reporter did about belly dancing. But he was very convincing, making up these stories. So he got a job and it kept him alive for 6 or 7 months. Tragically, on arrival, he saw his mother and siblings and his 6 and 7-year-old nephew and niece sent directly to the gas chamber. His father, he could not find. It was about, I guess, a couple of months after he was in the work detail in Auschwitz that he started getting very sick and had to work indoors. Heard guards saying, "We need some doctor assistance." Walks over, whips off his cap. "Jawohl, Herr Kommandant, I've had years of training as a doctor's assistant." They put him to work in the prisoner hospital. And in the prisoner hospital is where he found his father. Here's a photo of Siggy's father, Isidore, who tragically had been beaten to death. He lay dying. He died in front of his son, Siggy. And his father's last words to him were, "Keep kosher, look out for yourself." And his father was among many prisoners in the hospital where Siggy was working. The guards had Siggy pass out grated potatoes. And what Siggy did not know was the potatoes had been poisoned. There was this triage going on. Prisoners who were likely going to die were murdered and sent to the crematorium ovens so that there would be beds for prisoners who could come in who were not as sick and who could recover and be sent back to work. Well, he passed out these potatoes, and the next day he came and all of the prisoners lay dead in their patient barrack bunks, and on one of the bunks was his father. And when he was giving his testimony to the Shoah Foundation interviewer, this was in December of 2002 in that Fort Lee apartment, he said, "Where did they come up with these ideas, poisoned potatoes?" He says, I think I helped kill my father. That was a story he had in his entire life. He had never admitted that to friends, to family, to anyone. And this was he knew he was going to die. At this point, he had incurable multiple myeloma, and he knew he was going to die. So a lot of the stories that I'm telling you now came out in those final few weeks of his life. At one point, he had an opportunity to work inside the what were known as the Canada warehouses. Now, Canada was a country that prisoners in Auschwitz envisioned as being this place of milk and honey and a very comfortable place to live. So the warehouses where suitcases from the arriving trains were stockpiled. And if you could get a job working in these warehouses, sorting through all of these goods, that was considered a really good job, because prisoners coming in had in their suitcases, they had brought money, jewelry, medicines, all silver, whatever it may be. And if you were careful working in these Canada warehouses, you could squirrel some of this stuff away and use it later to barter for food or something to keep you alive. Here's a picture of Siggy on the right, on the left, and his friend Larry. This is after liberation, when they'd come to America. Larry was a few years older than Siggy at the time, so he would have been 22 and Siggy was 16 or 17. Larry got Siggy a job working with him in the Canada warehouses, and so he saved Siggy's life. When the Russians were approaching in the beginning of 1945 and the Nazis realized the end of the war was coming, Siggy had a chance to return the favor. Now, how did he do that? Well, it was bitter cold, and whatever prisoners remained alive, there were a few thousand of them, were marched by the Auschwitz guards from Auschwitz to camps deeper inside Nazi Germany, so away from the Russian forces who were approaching from the east, basically trying to hide their crimes by marching these prisoners to other camps. These came to be known as the death marches, because if you were not strong enough, if you were not able to keep up with the march, the guards would bring a pistol to the back of your head, and they would leave the bodies on the side of the road to be covered by the snow. And Larry was too weak and emaciated to continue walking on the death march. So rather than let his friend who had saved his life perish, Siggy turned around and bent down and had Larry climb on his back. And Siggy persevered, walking, carrying Larry. At night, when the guards bedded the prisoners down in the snow for their sleep for the night, pretty much Siggy was sure it was the end, because the shoelaces that were holding his wooden shoes on had deteriorated in the mud and in the rain and the snow, and his shoes were rubbing up and down against the heel of his feet. Now, if you got a splinter, if you were a prisoner in Auschwitz and you got a splinter from a shoe rubbing up and down your foot, you were going to die. Why? Because you'd get an infection and your body had no strength to combat that kind of an infection. So it meant death. Here was an example of the kind of thought process that Siggy Wilzig was able to engage. He looked around and said, what do I do? His philosophy was, if you make use of whatever it is that God has given you, you'll find that there are opportunities there you may not have anticipated. He had with him, his only possession from the camp when they left on the death march was a spoon. And when the guards weren't looking, he crawled over to this little sapling. He saw a little tree there. And with the edge of the spoon, he scored strips of bark. And then he rubbed those strips of bark between his palms to warm them up. And then he braided them and essentially created shoelaces from strips of bark, wrapped them around his shoes and tied them, very carefully tried, and sure enough, they held. He always looked back on that and said how amazing it is that his life was spared by a little strip of bark. Those were the kind of moments that made this project of writing Siggy's story such a revelation for me. And we'll get into some of those issues at the other end of this summary of his life story. After the liberation, the American forces came. Siggy and Larry were in concentration camp Mauthausen. Siggy weighed less than 85 pounds at that point. The Americans came, liberated the camp. He and Larry were sent to recover in a Red Cross hospital. And because here's a photo of him. I don't know if this is kind of small, if you can see that. This is Siggy about maybe 2 years after liberation, so 1947 or so. As a way of thanking his liberators, he and Larry both volunteered to work for the US Counterintelligence Corps. Now, this is the evidence gathering branch of the US Army where Simon Wiesenthal worked, for example. This was the office that went out and looked to arrest any Nazi officers or other operators of Hitler's camps who had run away at the time of liberation and were hiding out in towns and villages and forests and so on. Siggy distinguished himself as a very effective Nazi hunter. And he tells what to me was a very revealing story. He says his job working for the Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC, had him take his first plane ride. And he describes that it was a cold day, a rainy day, cloudy day. And the plane took off and climbed up through the clouds. Now, here's what you need to understand. Here's the background to this story. Inside Auschwitz, a big question among survivors was, is there a God? If there is a God, how could he allow this to happen? This, of course, was Elie Wiesel's great dilemma. The Holocaust could not have happened with God, but it could not have happened without God. So technically, in philosophical circles, this is called the problem of theodicy. How do you reconcile evil in a purposeful creation? So Siggy never lost his faith, but it was very challenged in Auschwitz, seeing what he saw and going through what he went through. On this plane ride, the plane broke through the cloud bank, and on the other side of the clouds, it was a bright, beautiful, sunshiny day. Beautiful blue sky, bright sunshine. And Siggy says that in that moment, his faith was confirmed. He said, God was talking to me, telling me, don't doubt that I've gone away. I'm here. I'm here. Sometimes a cloud like Hitler gets between us, but I'm still here. That's the kind of faith that Siggy Wilzig had all his life. Well, finally, he gets to America. In December of 1947, 21-year-old Siggy Wilzig arrives in America. He disembarks. It's the coldest winter on record. In the past half century in America, the coldest blizzard on record. He's given a room in this place. This is called Hotel Marseille, up in Harlem on 103rd Street and Broadway, where the highest organization, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, had found rooms for immigrants, refugees coming to America from Europe. And on his first day in America, Siggy is looking down from his window onto this snowy street, and he's thinking three things. He made three vows. He made three vows. He said, first, I'm never going to go hungry again. His second vow is I'm going to get married. I'm going to raise Jewish children and help restore the Jewish people. And his third vow was that whenever he saw injustice, he would always speak up and he would never decline to do so. And his first job in America was shoveling snow. He graduated from shoveling snow for $1 a day to cleaning toilets in sweatshops on the Lower East Side. And from there, he graduated to selling bow ties, knickknacks, and other items from a catalog. Here's Siggy holding up one of the products from this catalog that he was representing. He took the few meager commissions that he earned from his jobs and started buying stocks. Now, right around this time, a fruit and vegetable vendor in Newark, New Jersey, meets this young woman, Naomi Wilzig, and says, you look like a Khaled Moyed. You look like a very marriageable young lady. He says, I know a young guy. He's an immigrant. He just came over from Europe. Do you mind if I give him your name and phone number? His name is Siggi Wilzig. This was a full service fruit and vegetable vendor. And she says, sure, as long as he's Jewish, I don't think my parents will mind. Eventually, they did marry, but they had to elope because her parents did mind. They were not very happy about their daughter marrying an Auschwitz survivor. There was a lot of suspicion around survivors in those days. What did they have to do to stay alive? If all the others died and you're alive, either you did something horrible or you're damaged goods. Who knows whether they experimented on you or whatever. In any case, he was persona non grata with Naomi's parents. But he very quickly showed himself to be quite capable of business. And by buying these stocks, he basically taught himself to read the newspapers and the business section. He bought stock in a company called Wilshire Oil and Gas. At a party in New Jersey, he meets an older investor who also has stock in Wilshire. And this older man named Saul Diamond sees in Siggy a kind of moxie, a kind of energy that he said, you know, this company is ripe for a takeover. The board is old and they have no energy to grow the oil company, but I'm not feeling strong enough to lead a takeover myself. Would you like to do it? Here's the chance that Siggy's been waiting for. Instead of these modest little commissions from selling ties and knickknacks, he had a chance to get into oil and gas in America. Now, what you need to understand is that oil and gas was one of the most anti-Semitic of industries in the post-war years, but that only excited Siggy even more. He got a chance to, prove that the Jewish people not only had survived, but they were going to do very well. So he eventually bought enough stock. He convinced friends and neighbors and the few family who survived to come in with him. And they managed to take enough stock in the company that Siggy was appointed eventually president and then CEO and chairman of the board. He grew the company from, I think, initially $2 million a year to something like $20 million a year. And this was back in the 60s. Now he wants to grow the oil company even more, but he needs money. Oil companies take a lot of investment. There's long-term before return comes from seeding wells and processing, refining the oil and selling the oil and so on. So he needed cash flow. One of his advisors from the company law firm said, you know, banks have a lot of money. Why don't you get a bank? Siggy went looking for a bank. And he did the same thing with Trust Company of New Jersey that he had managed to do with Wilshire Oil and Gas. He led a takeover, grew the bank to such an extent that by the time he was done, he had built a business empire in oil and gas with assets of more than $4 billion. That's billion with a B. Along the way, because money itself was not the object for Siggy Wilzig, money was a means to an end. He wanted power and influence so that when he talked about the Holocaust, people would be obliged to listen. And he met Elie Wiesel at a dinner in Florida, and Elie Wiesel asked him to join him on the board of the then nascent US Holocaust Memorial Museum. Here you see Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, swearing in Siggy as a member of the Museum Council. And along with an appointment to the Washington Museum Council came an invitation to dine with President and Mrs. Carter in the White House. So here you have penniless, elementary school educated Siggy Wilzig coming over here with no business contacts, no supporters, no backers, dining with the President of the United States in the White House. As Siggy was getting older, he had a wicked sense of humor. I must tell you, one of the things that I loved about Siggy was his sense of humor. He was crazy, but he loved life so much that he would get up in the middle of a restaurant, for example, and start singing and dancing, and people would nudge his kids and say, "Does your father own the restaurant?" They say, "No, he just loves his life." For his, was it 70th birthday? They got him dinner with his favorite comedian, Jackie Mason. Siggy would interrupt a board meeting of his bank to go into a 20-minute Jackie Mason routine. Then he discovered he had cancer, and at first he was not in denial so much as convinced that his survival skills were so good that he could lick anything, including cancer. But the odds were against him. It was not to be. The one thing that Siggy had not done, remember those 3 vows? He never went hungry again. He married, raised 3 Jewish children, practicing Jews, and he spoke up against injustice, helped build the Washington Museum, gave hundreds of lectures about Holocaust remembrance. The one thing that he had not yet done as he approached the end of his life was tell his story. His son, Ivan, whom you see here in the middle, heard that Steven Spielberg was going to be at a fundraiser in the Hamptons. That's Ivan's younger brother, Alan, there. So they bought tickets to this charitable event, and Ivan goes up to the famous director and says, "You know, Mr. Spielberg, your Shoah Foundation wanted to get my father's testimony, but at the time he wasn't available. He never had time for anything but business, and then he got cancer. And he's not got long to live, but you've got to record him." Spielberg was convinced, and he sent his video crew to that apartment in Fort Lee. And that testimony, which was one of the longest testimonies in the entire 50,000 hours in the Spielberg Shoah Foundation archive, formed in large measure the basis of the book that brings us here this evening. This is a photo of Siggy on board the boat that brought him from Europe to America. That's the cover photo on the book. And he, in his boardroom in the bank, had his motto. I don't know if you can read it there. It says, "Free men who forget their bitter past do not deserve a bright future." That was a motto that was emblazoned on a marble plaque over the mantelpiece in his office. I'd like to close, as I had said earlier, this portion of our time together with a brief film. It's only 4 minutes long, but this will give you a chance to see Siggy, hear him speak to you in his own words, and then we'll come back and we're going to open this up to Q&A, and you're welcome to put your questions in the chat box. So here we go.
The longer I live, the more I remember. I'm trying to get away from the past, but it isn't possible. I am not liberated yet. I live in Auschwitz every day.
I was born in 26 in Krojanke. It was West Prussia, about 155 miles northeast of Berlin. In 35, we left everything, and the next morning we were in Berlin. Kristallnacht, I was 12 years old. As a child, and you see synagogues burn, Jewish homes go up in flames, and the police not doing anything. It was like the end of the world. They called it evacuation. That was the word. When the trains pulled up, I looked out of the window. I know we were going east, but going east didn't mean Auschwitz. We didn't know there was an Auschwitz. How did you survive 2 years of Auschwitz? It was not my education, which I didn't have any. It was my brain, which I didn't have much. It was the hand of God. What did I do next? I acquired control of Wilshire Oil Company of Texas, a little oil company. I bought it piece by piece by piece by piece. I was only the second Jew to become a president of a bank.
What kinds of nightmares do you have?
Very bad. It's something that is there. You are in Auschwitz every day. I wouldn't want to be anything else. If I would have to go through, God forbid, the same thing, I would go through the same thing as a Jew.
Well, there you have it, a bit of an overview of the life and saga of this extraordinary Holocaust survivor, Siggy Wilzig. I'm very happy to entertain any questions that you may have. If I may just offer one comment before we start. We're at a time now when memoirs, biographies, and video testimonies, such as what you've just seen, are gaining greater significance by the day. The survivor community is all but gone. And the question is debated in every Holocaust center and course on European history that I'm aware of. When the survivors are all gone, who will tell the story? By what means will the story be told? Through what medium? And with what intended impact on its audience? So hearing the words of the survivors is becoming all the more urgent. And it was a great honor for me to have been given a chance to help tell Siggy Wilzig's story. So the floor is yours.
Hi, Joshua. We have 2 questions in the Q&A. Please don't be shy. To those attending tonight, add your questions to the Q&A. Our first question is from Sam G. Did Wilsick find any relatives upon arriving in the U.S.?
Right. There was a brother who had survived the war. There was another who had was found through there were newspapers and publications after liberation listing the names of people who were living in DP camps, who were recovering in Red Cross hospitals and so on. And they found this one brother's name in those publications. But at one point, Siggy calculated that 59 members of his family had been murdered by the Nazis. So there really weren't very many left at all, a small handful.
The next question is from Sonia. What do you think Ziggy would say or do today in the face of growing anti-Semitism today?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question a little bit louder?
What do you think Ziggy would say or do today in the face of growing anti-Semitism?
Oh, my goodness. He would say, discuss the Holocaust, teach the Holocaust, raise young people to know what happened, and never stop talking and educating about the Holocaust. Because if you do, then we open the door to all kinds of unmentionable horrors that could happen again. Bear in mind, and we don't want to get political here, but we are living through this extraordinary time in history when science, facts, realities are being questioned. The very nature of truth itself is under attack. And it's tragic that history is vulnerable to misinterpretation, misappropriation. It's counterintuitive because you think if something is fixed in history, fixed in time, how can it change? How can it possibly be seen differently? And yet there's nothing that changes more than history. 10 people, depending on their motives, depending on their politics, depending on their attitudes, will interpret the same facts in 10 different ways. So it's critical that the education continue. I'm very pleased to report that as of this coming month, there's a Holocaust education initiative that's going to be made available to the entire school system of the state of Florida based on Siggy Wilzig's story. So I think he'd be very happy to know that his experiences, that his story live on beyond him.
The next question is from Emily and Bob. What's brought you to Siggy?
I'm tempted to be cute about it and say that was the universe. The phone rang about 8 years ago, and a voice at the other end, which turned out to be Siggy's eldest child, Ivan, said, I think you're the man who's got to write my father's story. Ivan learned from his father how to speak, very commanding voice. He said, you're the one who's going to write my father's story. I said, Ivan, thank you very much. I think I'm done. I've written about a dozen survivor memoirs, and it's just too tragic. It's too dark a time. And he blew up and said, too dark. My father was a torch of light, of hope for every immigrant who ever came to America. He was very impassioned about it. And he got me to change my mind. I looked into it, read that big stack of transcripts from the Shoah Foundation testimony that Siggy had offered, and realized there's something here that I had not encountered before, namely someone who didn't focus on the darkness, who came through that darkness. And you notice that in the book, only about the first 75 pages have to do with the Holocaust. I mean, literally the years that he spent in Camp Auschwitz on death marches and so on. The rest of this 320-page book are what he made of his life after coming to America. And the two are intimately connected because you have here someone who was able to channel his nightmares into an energy for building a business empire. And it took my breath away. I had not encountered anyone quite like him before. And I thought there was an important message there about what we humans are capable of doing, having come through the darkest of times, where we can still nonetheless go. I thought that was a story worth telling.
The next question is from Sonia. How did his wife and children cope with Siggy's painful past and carry it into their lives?
I'm sorry, once more, please. How did his wife and children cope with?
Siggy's painful past and carry it into their lives.
Yeah, it was very difficult. I mean, that part's practically textbook. The family of survivors very often have to go through their own kind of personal hell because they live with the memories of what their father, their husband lived through. And it affected their lives quite dramatically. The book describes, for example, how Naomi could never cook a meal where the elements of the dish were merged together. They all had to be separated. The vegetables, the meat, everything had to be separated because merging elements too quickly reminded Siggy of the kind of scraps of garbage that they were fed to eat as prisoners in concentration camp Auschwitz. The children could not buy souvenir mugs. They would go to, colonial America sites and, you can get a souvenir mug, but they couldn't buy metal mugs because it reminded him of the kind of tin mug that they were given to use in Auschwitz. When black leather coats became a fashion trend, they couldn't wear those clothes. It reminded their father of the Gestapo outfits. So, and to say nothing of the nightmares. I mean, you heard him describe it himself. He lives with nightmares so horrible he doesn't want to even describe them for people. I mean, I'll tell you, it's in the book. There were times when he dreamed that his own children were marching into the fires of the crematorium oven. How do you live with that? He exorcised his demons by talking about them, by going in front of audiences, telling his stories, imploring people, please do not forget. Please know what happened so that we can be vigilant that the circumstances never recur that can lead to such extreme tragedy. He was the first survivor, for example, to address cadets and officers at Military Academy West Point in the early 90s. And he spoke with such passion. The whole audience of these military were weeping like children. And it was reported in the New York Times the following day that it was filled with empathy and it was very personal. And his message was, look, one of you may be president someday, and you have to know what happened so that you can be prepared to stop this should it ever recur. That filled his life.
The next question is from Jennifer. Can you please share more about Siggy's daughter, who was so helpful in his business? And thank you so much for speaking on this important subject.
No, you're very welcome. Siggy Wilzig, who is arguably the most charitable person I've ever met, was, how to describe this, Siggy's secret weapon. Maybe you could say it like that. At one point, the big, the culminating drama in the book is a confrontation that Siggy had with the Federal Reserve. By owning an oil and gas company and a bank at a time when the United States was facing runaway inflation, the Fed insisted that all companies in America, all non-banking companies that owned a bank, had to divest. Either they had to get rid of their bank, or they had to get rid of their commercial activity and focus exclusively on the bank. They couldn't do both. Siggy, who was a business genius without ever having gone to business school, had grown these two companies to become hugely successful. He was making shareholders money hand over fist. He was giving loans to people who were never going to get loans anywhere else. He was doing immense good. So he was outraged when the Fed insisted that he divest himself of one of these two companies. I guess I'm not really giving away the whole story, but basically what he did was he was forced to step down, but by putting Sherry at the helm of Wilshire Oil and Gas, he could still, shall we say, have a voice in how things were run. People still kind of understood that he was still running the show. Sherry was extraordinarily competent. She had wonderful business training, and really was Siggy's right-hand person in his business affairs. And she gets a lot of credit for having gone through boxes and boxes of old papers from years gone by to help me with the parts of this book that I really had no training in business and banking and oil or whatever. She guided me every step of the way there. So she gets a huge vote of thanks.
I will combine the next two questions. They are about Siggy's children, their occupations, what they are doing. Is Sherry still running his businesses?
Sherry still runs Wilshire, although it's less about oil and gas these days than real estate, interestingly. But she spends a lot of her time caring for indigent Holocaust survivors. She works with an organization called the Blue Card, and I urge people attending here to go to bluecard.org, I believe, and see the extraordinary work they're doing on behalf of Holocaust survivors who are housebound or who may not have transportation to doctor appointments or money for medicines or whatever it may be. Sherry started a division of the Blue Card for survivors with cancer, which of course is what killed her father. So if you would like to make a donation, you're welcome to go to the blue card and look for the Siggy Wilzig cancer link on the blue card site. Alan, who was head of the bank after Siggy was obliged to step down because of his health, successfully led the bank to its sale, which is what basically turned the fortunes of this immigrant who arrived with only $240 in his pocket into a multimillionaire many times over, and continues to work in business and has his charitable interests. And he's also an avid sportsman, good-looking devil, and put him on the back of his Tesla motorbike, and it's quite a picture. Eldest son, Ivan, has a music career. He goes under the moniker Peace Man. And it's one of the things that brought us together is the other hat that I wear is in my religion and philosophy educator role is teaching about Hinduism and the yoga traditions. And part of the yoga practice is the chanting of mantras, these sacred sounds. Ivan, in his music career, did a cover version of the Krishna Mantra, the chanting of the Hare Krishna Mantra, which is a meditative process. And if you go to YouTube, you'll see the Krishna video that he made of that. All of the music that Ivan makes is on the theme of a kinder, gentler, more peaceful, more loving world. And it was inspired by his father's experiences in the camps. And just toward the end of Siggy's life, Ivan got to bring him a video cassette of a documentary that had been made after 9/11 of the John Lennon song, Imagine. And in this documentary, they showed different people doing different renditions of that beautiful ode to peace. And one of the people featured in the film is Sir Ivan Wilzig, AKA Peaceman, singing Imagine. And the producers, inspired by Siggy's description of his father's story, injected into the documentary pictures of the camps and the survivors. And Siggy was so moved by that. He realized that his mission really was successful now, that all three of his children were helping him to keep Holocaust memory alive. And I think that probably gave him the greatest peace at the end of his life.
Next question is, how is Siggy remembered and treated in Israel?
Oh my goodness. The greatest miracle of all in Siggy's mind and heart was the state of Israel. You know, if you study the Holocaust, you can look at it from different angles. Of course, the human dimension being the most critical. You can also look at it from a legal angle, which is that the Holocaust was a series of crimes, extreme crimes, that were committed in violation of the international charters, the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention, and which were therefore punishable under international law. You can also look at it from the angle of this is what happened to the Jewish people when they did not have their own state, when they did not have their own army, when they did not have their own homeland. So for Siggy, the creation of the state of Israel was the greatest of all miracles, and he was an avid supporter of Israel. Raised millions upon millions of dollars, and was awarded the Prime Minister's Medal in appreciation of the services that he had rendered to the state of Israel.
This next question is for you, Joshua. How do you handle emotionally and psychologically these traumatic stories?
With great difficulty. In my family, I'm considered the spiritual one, the guy who does the yoga and vegan and all that stuff. And for years, I was having a very difficult time because people in yoga studios or in college classes on Hinduism or whatever, who knew that I also had a hand in Holocaust history, were always asking me, how do you put these two things together? How do you reconcile your vision of a benign and beneficent and purposeful creation with what happened in Europe 80 years ago? How do you put these two things together? And I did not have a good answer. I did not know what to say. Well, an opportunity came along. I married someone who happens to be the eldest child in the Fortunoff jewelry family. And my late father-in-law, Alan Fortunoff, was a big supporter of the Yale University Holocaust Video Archive, where I am now on the board of advisors. And when the opportunity came along to work with the scholars at Yale, I jumped on it. I wanted to know, I wanted to have a better answer for people. I wanted to be able to say, you know what, you can still be a believer, you can still have this beautiful vision of a purposeful creation, and find a way of reconciling, or not reconciling, but at least understanding the place of evil. Technically, the word is theodicy. How do we reconcile these two things? How does the Holocaust happen in a purposeful creation? And I'm not Solomon, I don't have all the answers, but I think I'm a little bit closer. And I've come up with a short form answer because I have to, because we all don't have a lot of time. Our time is up. What I tell people is, when we turn away from our own deepest true nature as human beings, we can fall terribly, terribly far. When we turn toward our true nature, we can soar very, very high. That may not answer everything, but it's how I live with it. What do you think, Carrie? Was that okay?
Yes, I was just checking our Q&A. We have two last questions. It's 8 o'clock now. I'm respectful of everyone's time. So these will be the last two questions we address tonight. In social media groups, whenever I try to warn about the rise of totalitarianism today in the context of my father's experience with Nazism, I'm often shut down because my observation is regarded as political commentary, which is not allowed. How do I overcome this restriction?
Gingerly. You're walking on thin ice there. I think if you stick to the facts of things rather than getting into political opinions, you might be on surer ground, safer ground. We can legitimately point back to this period in history when demagoguery held sway over a nation, when that demagoguery essentially weaponized an entire people by playing on their fears, their bitterness, their anger. And that hostility, it's a cold, cruel world out there, and people want to blame somebody. The Jews have been a very, very convenient scapegoat for all the ills of history. If you remember the footage from January 6th, we've just come to the 1-year commemoration of that horrible time. You may remember the people storming the Capitol building with the sweatshirt and with the words Camp Auschwitz emblazoned on the front of their sweat. This isn't ancient history. This is alive today. That same bitterness and hostility toward the other lies at the heart of the violence and the hatred, the bigotry, and the tragedies that we've been witness to in recent months and years here in the United States. So rather than getting into the politics of how one votes, if you look at the facts of history and recognize that, democracy is robust, but it's not invincible. Democracy relies in all instances on the goodwill and efforts of men and women of impeccable motive and clear thinking in order to operate effectively. And when we allow bias, prejudice, fear to overcome good thinking, clear-headed thinking, that's when we have that turn away from our true nature and that fall into some very, very dark places. So avoid policy issues, avoid which side of the aisle you come from. If you speak to the facts of history, I think you may be on more solid ground.
There will be one more question tonight, but before that, I just want to make a couple announcements. As Joshua's publisher sent us 100 copies of Unstoppable that we will give out to the first 100 registrants of this program. So you will see an email from me, Carrie, tomorrow about how to receive the books. Very exciting. Also, this program has been recorded and I will soon upload it to our YouTube channel, and I will share the link with you as well. And I'm going to ask our one last question. I want to thank our audience for being so engaged and enthusiastic about Joshua's visit and the topic tonight and Siggy's story. So here we go, last question. Were movies made of any of his talks that brought tears to the eyes of the audiences?
Yes, I think if you go to unstoppablesiggy.com, unstoppablesiggy.com, you'll find videos there of Siggy lecturing. You'll also find some videos of people like the late radio talk show host Barry Farber and others talking about Siggy. So that's one place I can direct you to. There's some talk about a cable television series based on the book. If it happens, fine, you'll get word of it, and then we can all cry together. But for the time being, I think if you go to the website, you'll see some rather moving footage there. You've been a wonderful audience. I really want to thank you so very much for your hospitality and for a chance to share Siggy's story with you. This is an honor and a joy for me to talk about him. I think there may have been 50 or 60 such programs to date around the country, and there's another 30 or 40 lined up, and I never grow tired of talking about him. And so thank you for an opportunity to speak about him again. I think you're still muted, Carrie.
Sorry about that, I was on mute. Thank you, Joshua, and thank you to the Friends of the Fort Lee Public Library for helping make this program happen tonight. And thank you to everybody who joined and is still with us at 8:07 p.m. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.